Picture a typical corporate office building at 9 o'clock on a weekday night. The lights are off, the elevators are quiet, and the workday is over. But if you stand on the streets of Manila, the capital of the Philippines, you'll witness hundreds of fresh, energized workers just arriving for their shift. While the local time zone sleeps, these workers are answering phones for American companies, processing data for British banks, and moderating content for global social media platforms. The sheer numbers are staggering. Roughly 1.8 million Filipinos work in these traditional business process outsourcing, or BPO, roles. But they are only the visible fraction of a much larger ecosystem. Another 9.9 million people, nearly 22% of the country's entire workforce, are engaged in the digital gig economy, executing remote contracts and microtasks from their bedrooms and smartphones. The presence of over 11 million people working in the dark indicates a structural dependency. The Philippine economy is tethered directly to the daylight hours of the West. This chart compares monthly wages in Manila. A minimum wage worker takes home $250, but the estimated family living wage needed to avoid crisis is $460. A registered nurse starts at roughly $350. Even with a specialized degree, local employment falls short of basic survival. A worker can bypass this math entirely by logging online. A virtual assistant charging foreign clients a modest $5 an hour can bring in $800 to $1,200 a month. The social contract breaks down when the domestic economy cannot reward education with stability. The country's top talent is logically forced out of local hospitals and schools and pushed into invisible, borderless gig work. The wiring for this global supply chain was laid centuries ago. Under Spanish rule, starting in 1565, the colonial government implemented the encomienda system. They extracted 40 days of unpaid labor a year from Filipino men to build ships and roads for Spain's trans-Pacific trade, deliberately avoiding any investment in local manufacturing. When the United States took control in 1898, they phased out forced labor but introduced a new mechanism for integration. They rolled out a nationwide public education system taught entirely in English. The explicit goal was to make Filipino workers instantly compatible with American administrative and economic systems. This access to U.S. labor markets triggered a psychological shift. Between 1906 and 1946, over 125,000 Filipinos migrated to Hawaii to work on sugar plantations. Following World War II, thousands of Philippine-trained nurses were flown directly into American hospitals. The workforce realized they could earn significantly more abroad than they ever could at home. Over hundreds of years, the Philippines was systematically engineered to function as a port to serve global demand, rather than a factory to generate its own domestic wealth. In 1974, President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. faced rising unemployment and a domestic economic crisis. He issued a presidential decree that officially formalized labor export as national economic policy, sending workers to the Middle East and beyond as a political stopgap. By the 1990s, physical migration reached a breaking point, so the strategy pivoted. If the Philippines couldn't physically send everyone abroad, they would use digital infrastructure to bring Western corporations to Manila, opening the first call centers. American companies were initially heavily invested in India for outsourcing, but they found that Filipino workers possessed highly specific cultural soft skills, like pakikisama, a deep emphasis on maintaining harmony and smoothing over conflict. This resulted in unparalleled empathy and customer de-escalation, lowering complaint rates and increasing customer satisfaction. This dual export strategy created a macroeconomic shield. This graph tracks two massive revenue streams: overseas remittances, currently hit around $38 billion a year, and BPO revenues add another $38 billion right on top of that. Together, they keep the nation's GDP afloat. But that shield came with a severe cost. Because exporting people generated billions of dollars in foreign currency, the government lost the immediate political incentive to endure the short-term pain required to build competitive domestic industries and fix local wages. Around 2020, the nature of outsourcing shifted again. Startups like Scale AI arrived in the Philippines, replacing voice-based customer service with silent, click-based microtasks. Workers became data labelers. For hours on end, they stared at blurry images of streets, drawing digital boxes around cars, highlighting lane markings, and tagging pedestrian behavior. They structured raw, messy information into clean datasets. At first, the pay was highly competitive for the local market, but eventually the algorithms became better at pattern recognition. Tasks that previously paid whole dollars plummeted to pennies, dropping earnings to as low as 30 cents an hour. By manually feeding cognitive data into these neural networks, Filipino gig workers spent years training the very machines designed to replace them. The replacement is already happening. In 2024, the fintech giant Klarna announced that its AI customer support assistant had handled 2.3 million conversations, doing the exact equivalent workload of 700 full-time human agents. The warm, neutral voices and diplomatic scripts used by these new AI agents aren't magic. They are pre-trained on the millions of perfectly de-escalated conversations originally handled by human workers on the Manila night shift. This displacement in Manila previews a broader collapse across the global gig economy as companies everywhere transition to the same automated systems. For decades, the gig economy served as a desperate workaround for a broken social contract. Now, artificial intelligence is closing that loophole. The Philippines can no longer afford to rent its labor to foreign systems. It has to face the long-delayed reckoning of building its own.